Okay, let's talk storyboards. So, what the best practices are and how you can approach making your own. So, storyboarding comes somewhere in the pre-production stage, or sometimes called the pre-visualization stage. And so, this is where we are going from coming up with our initial script and initial sketches to pitching our stories as frames of our movie, right? So, making a lot of different drawings and then putting them together in sequential order to tell a story. Um, and then eventually, once that's done, putting it to time, so as a video with sound, so that we can get the timing correct. And here's a more close-up example. You can see people bored and exhausted because storyboard artists are usually expected to make hundreds of drawings, sometimes in the middle of a day, and then you're in story review, you're usually looking at the exact same thing with minor tweaks many, many, many times. So just like the other story pitch elements, like the transcript or the script treatment, these are a visual roadmap for the film. So in those cases, we're focusing more on, when we're talking about the scripts, we're focusing on dialogue and moment-to-moment information. When we're talking about the treatment, we're looking at a broader view of the film in terms of what happens at each stage of the film, like what's the primary purpose of Act 1 and Act 2. For storyboards and animatic, we are diving into the visual storytelling. So we're looking at how the perspective of the viewer, what the camera angle is, what the layout and placement of characters, environments, assets are. So this is where we're starting to get a little bit into cinematography. It's not locking anything into place. So a lot of the cases, it's just meant to illustrate what might be happening at this moment between characters and how the camera is framing the characters. But it's essentially just getting into the visual process of telling this moment in time. And it's supposed to be really fast and really simple. So the drawings are supposed to be really quick. They're supposed to be very illustrative. And drawings are faster than doing anything in 3D unless you're super good at 3D and really bad at drawing. That's why we tend to storyboard. It's a great way for us to get our ideas up on the board and share them with other people. So everything in a film, in a major production film, is supposed to be in service of the story. So shots, there's a lot. A film is made up of a lot of shots cut or gathered together into sequences, and these shots cut in seconds. And characters are moving in 3 dimensions in very complex manners. So these quick editing and these complex movements and these complex 3 dimensional scenes means that without the proper attention to how shots flow together, it's easy to lose the audience's focus. So as a storyboard artist, we are focusing on not just clarity in what's being told to the viewer, but also how those parts of the story come together, how one scene or one shot follows the next shot. So we want to emphasize the important elements, right? We don't really want to draw things that aren't important and aren't necessary. We want to just focus on the things that are important in the story. We want to simplify the staging, again, for the same purpose of not making it too complicated. You want to make it fast and easy to read. And so this is where principles of drawing and design come in. If you want to be a good storyboard artist, you need to kind of understand value and contrast and composition. And you need to draw and edit quickly. So do it in a smart way where you're not spending more than 5 to 10 minutes on a single frame. Story beats are kind of like what treatment is to a script. So a treatment is the broader view, kind of like the first step where you're lining out the major plot points, and then the script would be the detailed descriptions of moment-to-moment actions in the film. A beat board is kind of like a storyboard where you're doing little illustrations or storyboard images of key moments in the film. And so this is kind of like you could think of this sort of like a first pass at your story. They might not be representative of what your final scenes are going to be, but tell us what's going to happen in the film and what it's going to might look like at different stages, and give us a good idea of what the feel of the film is. The storyboard will, just like the script, will flesh out the individual scenes and try to more literally capture what we're going to be doing in the final film, which is camera angle, camera movement, where characters specifically placed, what they're doing, etc. So here's another example. Sorry for being kind of blurry. Beat boards, I think I have a lot of examples in here from Grizz and Norm, so I recommend you guys Google and check them out. And so they have some really great design and storyboard related little short tutorial slash illustrations. So in this case, the beat board would be you have this kid who gets bullied and turns into the Hulk. So a beat board would show kid being bullied, kid transforming, and kid turning into a Hulk. So these moments aren't necessarily what's going to be actually shown in the storyboards, right? So you don't see a shot like this, and you're not going to see a shot like that necessarily. But it's telling the people who you're pitching the story to and you're sharing the story ideas with what is actually going to happen. The storyboards, on the other hand, are showing are keeping in mind like what camera movement's going to be doing, right? Thinking of staging and placement of characters and how these shots flow from one to the other, right? So we even have camera movement information, right? So the background is moving, we pan the camera up, and then this block of bullies, kind of just burst out the side of the frame, and as the kid bumps into it, right, and falls over. So it has a moment to moment flow that's very cinematic. When we're coming up with our storyboards and we're doing our drawings, it's important to keep in mind how the staging of the elements in terms of perspective and composition and placement changes the content of the film and the mood of the film. And this is kind of true for just when you describe movies in general and how they're shot, right? Something that is really dynamic is going to feel energetic and fast paced and dramatic, right? It's going to give us a lot of energy in the film. Something that's shot flat is going to be funny, right? There's a common term called flat is funny, right? So it's the idea that kind of flattening things out, making them kind of lined up with each other, not a lot of depth and perspective makes things a little bit more humorous. Whereas exaggerated perspective, unusual, not necessarily unusual camera angles, but dynamic camera angles, a lot of depth, right? You can see how deep this guy is compared to all the guys in the background, and then compared to this one, right? And you get the sense just looking at this between these two, this one feels dramatic. This feels like an action movie, and this one right here feels kind of goofy. And then you can also take something that is um, it's expected to be shot in a certain way and change it to the other, like going from flat to dynamic can really change like your perception of what you would normally think with someone using a computer, right? I see this picture of this guy on a laptop. It's a very flat shot, not a lot of depth. The camera angle's straight on, and sorry for the little Google Slides thing. And so that's great. It's flat. It's not meant to be a special moment, right? But all of a sudden now I move my camera over here. It's a more dynamic shot. We're looking up at him, a lot of perspective. This shot now has been elevated to something way more interesting or way more unusual. Like it feels like it's supposed to be more important. This could have been a filler shot. Now it feels like a really important shot. And I wanted to show this example to just kind of illustrate the point that drawing only what's important is what you should focus on when you're doing storyboards. A lot of times, environment and context is helpful for us to see. So anything that, like, so for instance, this character's hands coming up off the table, right? That seems like it must be relevant to what's going on, and you get a little bit of context of this environment. But for the most part, the idea is this interaction between these characters. So we're just focusing on drawings from the characters. It's also very flat. So this is like a comedy. So it's really probably it's a cartoon. So I'm assuming it's a comedy. And so a lot of cartoons that are, like Saturday morning kind of fare, you would expect to have flat staging, right? Because you don't want to make it super dramatic or dynamic. You just want it to be focusing on the jokes that are being coming out of the shots, right? So in this case, all these shots are very flat, right? There's not a lot of depth in terms of one character really close and one character really, really far away, exaggerated perspective, unusual camera angles. All the cameras are kind of like set at the character's eye levels, right? So it's very safe. And then you contrast to something like this. This feels so dynamic. Like we have like a fisheye lens, so it's distorting the perspective. We have this character in the extreme foreground, and we have this character, the main character in the extreme background. Very unusual but interesting composition. So this obviously feels like a much more action-oriented shot. So let's talk about continuity. Continuity refers to how our storyboards and our shots flow together from one to the next. The better that continuity is maintained or paid attention to, the clearer it is for the viewer as they watch. It's easier for them to follow along, they don't feel lost, and you're making a flow or a connection between your shots that's satisfying to follow. One of the ways we can do this, create continuity, is using screen direction or paying attention to screen direction. And screen direction is the idea that you have action or a character moving from one side of the frame to the next. So in this case over here, from Grizz and Norm, we have a character moving from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen throughout these shots or between these cuts until he gets to something that in screen causes him to move in a different direction, right? And then we are going from right to left now, and we would continue that going forward. So this isn't a hard and fast rule to have to follow, of course, but it is really nice. It feels good when we follow it, and it makes it simpler for the viewer to follow along with what's going on in the scene. Screen position is very similar to screen direction in the sense that it's just maintaining a connection with a part of the screen, so the left or the right hand side or the middle, between shots. So keeping a focus element or a character or the action in that same spot. So over here, our focal point in this sequence of shots is this man, right? And you can see between all these shots, they might be very different shots, but he is maintaining screen position by staying in that same local position in the screen. All right, so he's in the left-hand side all throughout these. And especially when a character is moving around and doing something dynamic, we can still maintain screen position, and it's easy for us to make the mental leap between shots that is that same character because we're already looking at that location and we make that adaptation quickly. So Superman or whoever the superhero is, he launches up into the air and we switch to a new cut. And even though this is a pretty simple example to follow, it's really easy for me to make that mental leap that, oh, that's still Superman because he's in the same position as he was in the previous shot. And I don't have to search around as well. So as a viewer, I appreciate it. So here in this blog called the Art Center, we have screen position and screen direction going on. We have these characters who maintain a specific screen position. So this man is always on the left and she is always on the right. And so even though we are changing our camera to different positions, he's always on the left and she's always on the right. So that first shot, we're doing an over shoulder talking to her, and then we switch to the other over the shoulder. He's still on the left, she's still on the right. We come down to a single shot on her, and in this case, she's centered, but we could have easily also restaged this to keep her more in that screen right, so it's easier to follow. And then in this other shot where she's walking away from him, she's going from left to right, right? Because her side is the right-hand side, the screen right. And so by going from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, she's kind of maintaining her screen position and screen direction. So screen position, just to reiterate, is the position of the elements or the focal points within the frame. And screen direction is the idea of movement through the frame in a particular direction, left or right, or up and down. So as with many of these rules, they're not going to be followed all the way, and it's sometimes impossible. And there's also good reason to break it. So in this case here, from the Art Center blog, they've actually shown another iteration of this where they needed to have the character move in a different direction. So here we have what we had before where he's on the left, she's on the right, and they're actually going to switch. And in order to help facilitate this, we've actually seen in shot her moving from the right hand side to the left hand side. So by doing this in between or right after the shot, before we actually have them on different areas, by showing them changing positions, it's easier for us to follow along, right? If it just went from this second frame to this frame right here, they've all essentially magically flipped sides and it gets a little hard to follow. So you'd probably want to have the characters visibly change screen position or screen direction in frame and not out of frame. So it's easier for us to follow. So here's one more example from the Art Center blog, and this one is showing screen direction and how even though we're changing camera angles and we're moving a long distance and there's quite a bit of action, because we're maintaining screen direction and being conscious of it, it's pretty easy to follow. So we have this weird platypus Bigfoot monster kicking this leprechaun. And so I guess Manny and Khan. So I guess when Manny kicks Khan, Khan is going to be traveling from screen left from screen left into screen right. So he's going to be maintaining this rightward screen direction. Okay, so he kicks. He goes. Khan goes from left and he goes right, and he exits the frame on the right hand side. And we switch to a new camera, and he enters from the left and it continues to go to the right. So he's maintaining this left to right direction. And we cut to another camera, and still we have this same movement or direction, even though we're shooting from a different position and angle, which could be very hard to follow. But because we're maintaining screen direction going left to right, it's easy for us to follow along as a viewer. So the 180-degree rule is related something that's related to this screen position and continuity of screen direction. It's an imaginary line that you can draw between characters in the scene or moments of action. Like, if a character is running from one area to another area, you would draw a line between that. And so this invisible line acts as a good guide to where you can place your cameras. So in this case, we have a characters, and the main action is being their conversation between the two of them, right? And so we have these top views showing the different cameras that are down here. So this is A, B, C, and D, right? And this is showing where they're actually located related to these characters in the space. So as long as like that, the camera is showing like this guy, the man on the left-hand side and the dog on the right-hand side, it's easy for us to kind of keep our continuity, right? We can kind of between A, B, and C, right? A, B, and C, that guy's on the left, dog is on the right. It's easy for us to follow between these shots, even though we're making these editing cuts. But you'll see camera D is no good because all of a sudden the man who's always been on the left of the dog is now on the right of the dog. And so if you cut between this shot and then that shot, it takes a mental moment for the viewer to catch up, and they might feel lost or confused, right? And so you can see from this line, right, as soon as you choose a camera angle, like let's say we started with A, we'd want to stay on this side of the line, right? So it doesn't really matter where we put our camera on this side or in this space, right? We're still going to have pretty good continuity between our shots because he's always going to be on the left and the dog is always going to be on the right. So you got to keep that in mind, that line of action where you put your camera can really affect continuity just because of where characters are placed. So you tend to try to stick to one side of that 180-degree line as much as possible. But again, there's ways to break it and ways to transition. Here's some more visualizations, right? Here's the line of action between the characters, and here's the cameras, and we're on this side of that line of action. Here's the camera angles, and here's another example. So now I want to talk about motivating your camera cuts. So this is like editing, right? How you choose to move and when to choose from one camera angle to the next camera angle. And when I say motivate your camera cuts, I mean changing to a new shot or a new camera angle because of a particular moment within the story, right? So by doing this, it makes the editing feel seamless, it feels purposeful, and it makes it easier to follow the film just like continuity does, right? It makes it easy for me to keep up. So you can use several actions or events to trigger a cut. So for instance, a character looks off frame or a sound occurs off frame, like you're watching something and in the film you hear a glass window shatter, right? That's a great opportunity for moving to a new camera angle because the audience is like, I want to see what just happened, right? Characters entering or exiting frame or pointing to something or about to be picking up something and looking at something are also great spots to switch to a new camera angle because, again, as the audience, there's new information or there's changes of information and what's happening in the scene that we want to know a little bit more about or we're comfortable with seeing more of. So in this case, on the right from Zootopia, I don't think this was used in the actual film. We have, Nick, he pulls CDs out of a glove box, and the joke or the gag is to have like this little shrew as some lounge singer or something like that. And so, we want to have that a close-up shot so we can see the cover because that's the whole gag, right? So showing that gag or showing that joke to the audience is a great motivator for cutting between this shot right here to this shot. So this is a great example of motivated cuts I wanted to walk through. So in this case, we start with a medium close shot. This character is doing something with his hands, it doesn't really matter. And then we have a notification in the storyboard of something happening off screen. The character, this is where we cut, right? Because we want to see what this character is looking at, right? Because we see him, we hear the noise, we see him turn, and we want to know what the heck what that was and what is he looking at now. So we have a cut, and we are seeing an over-the-shoulder shot. And so the choice for this is probably to show a relationship between this character we've been focusing on and what he's looking at. And then we also have a new cut that is to get closer to the bull, right? Because this new character is in the scene, and we want to get a proper introduction to him, so we get a little bit closer. So now that we have an introduction to this character, we know he's in here, we know what he looks like, we cut to back to their relationship. So we have the reverse shot of this shot here, right? Here's the reverse shot of an over shoulder of the bull looking at the guy. So these aren't cuts, it says cut, but these aren't actually cuts. And so the guy gets up and he starts to walk over. And then we have a cut because this is kind of an awkward angle to see this character walking up to the bull, the man walking up to the bull, because we're kind of cutting off a lot of space between them. So this is where they cut to this wider shot, right? And showing them getting closer. And you can see there's notifications here of the cow moving, but also the camera moving, getting closer. Maybe it means cropping in. I'm not exactly sure, to be honest. And so we have another cut because we have a gag here. We want this bull to, it's kind of an absurd little sketch, but we have this bull getting closer to the guy, and we want to kind of make this guy really uncomfortable with this. So you can kind of feel this guy is the center of the shot, and we're focusing on him. And the bull kind of acts as like this giant shape that is just crowding the frame and crowding the guy. And then we want to see this intense look on the bull. So again, this is another good place for us to cut. So these are all motivations, right? A noise off screen, a character looking away, wanting to tell more information, so getting close to the bull, right? Trying to get us back into the story or getting us back into the interaction of the characters. Again, making another cut to see important information that we might be missing. Here's another cut that's meant to get us closer to a character interaction or a joke. So in this case, it's a joke and a character interaction where we want to see this character reacting to the bull. And then we want to, again, another piece of information we want to give the viewer. We want to show this intense look in the bull's eye and this guy's nervous reaction. So, and again, another great place for a motivated cut. So here's another great example I'm just going to quickly walk through for motivating your camera cuts. So in this case, we have two characters vegging on a couch. And here, through the storyboards, we're notified that there's a sound of someone knocking on the door off screen. And we have our character look off screen. So that's a great place for us to make a new camera cut because I want to know, hey, what the heck is, who's knocking on the door and what is he looking at, right? So we have this new shot over the shoulder of him looking at the door. And so now here's another place for us to do another cut to a new camera angle, a reverse shot, because we want to see how the person is reacting to this new stimulus in their environment, right? The door's knocking, I want to know what the heck this kid's going to do about it. So we see his reaction, we see him get up, see him exit frame, and as soon as he leaves that frame, because this is no longer important, we've now switched to a new cut, and the character enters frame. So essentially, if there's new information off screen or in another part that we can't see, that's a great place to motivate a camera cut. So as soon as there's something that grabs our attention off screen that we should look at, well, and even if it's something that's on screen that we want to look at that we can't see very well, that's a great place for inserting a cut or motivating our cuts. Here's another simple example. So in this case, in the first shot, we have a character eating toast. Then we switch, we make a cut to a new shot looking at his dinner plate. His hand comes in, grabs a piece of bacon. So that cut from shot 1 to shot 2, or storyboard frame 1 to storyboard frame 2, there isn't much motivation there, right? It's kind of like the director making the decision, but the audience isn't really understanding why we had to switch to that new shot, right? So in this case, when he drew the storyboards, this artist, he went ahead and actually added a new board where you have the character reacting off screen again, right? So this is, again, providing us motivation for that cut because he looks down at his plate. There's a good reason for us to now switch over to the next frame, and the audience isn't left waiting to understand why the heck we switched to a new camera angle. So in this case, it's just an addition of a single very simple drawing or even moment in the story to motivate this new camera change. So this example from Lilo and Stitch storyboards, we have Stitch sitting on the porch. We hear the door opening and we see Stitch turn around and look off frame. So we're motivated to switch to a new camera angle to see both characters. And because Lilo's really sad or despondent about something, we want to focus in on her, right? So we get a tighter close-up shot of her. So we motivated to cut just on her to see her reaction to whatever she's feeling. And then she most likely starts walking out of frame. And so we switch to a new camera angle so we can see her walking away from Stitch. And so she leaves Stitch. Stitch then travels to follow after or chase after. And because he's exiting frame, or it might be hard to frame both of them, we switch and cut to a new camera angle, right? So again, talking about, think about the motivations for your cuts, right? So in this case, new information, wanting to know more about something that's in frame. So wanting to get more information about Lilo's reaction, right? Following characters in action as they leave the frame. So these are all great motivators for our film. So most of you are probably familiar with the rule of thirds, but I wanted to cover it briefly because I think it can be really helpful for framing and staging your shots and balancing your composition with your characters and the elements in your scene to make a fun and dynamic image. So the rule of thirds, for those who aren't familiar with it, is you essentially break up your frame into 9 squares by cutting it to thirds horizontally and vertically, right? So we cut it to thirds horizontally, cut it to thirds vertically. So by putting elements of our composition or of our shot at these intersection points or along these lines, tends to create a dynamic but well-balanced composition. And generally the reason why that is when things are centered in the middle of the frame, the composition starts to feel a little too balanced and a little boring or flat, right? So we push them over to the side, it feels a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more engaging, a little bit more interesting. But we don't want to push it too far to the side because as we get closer to the frames, it starts to feel a little uncomfortable, like they're kind of falling out of the frame. So this is kind of like a sweet zone. These areas are sweet areas that it's nice to have. It just feels right to have certain composition or compositional elements line up here to make a balanced but interesting composition. So here's a few examples. I think they kind of speak for themselves because just focus on what you want to look at, like what's important in the frame, and see where they line up with this grid. So in this case, we have this wolf who's obviously the main focal point of this composition, and he's lining up with one of these focal points where the cross intersections are. Here we have Linguini's eyes, right? The eyes of a character usually have a lot of visual weight to them, and so that lines up with that rule of thirds point right here, that focal point. And then Remy, he lines up with that. So the two most important elements of this frame balanced out at these rule of third lines and intersection points. Jack Nicholson's eyes and his figure lining up with these two lines here. The two main characters in this shot, right? Again, lining up really closely to these rule of thirds intersection points. Value and tone are really useful for creating clear storyboards that are easy to follow and look at. Just like when you're creating a painting or a drawing or illustration, contrast and value play a big role in directing the viewer's eye and making things easy to understand. So high contrast, which is a bigger difference between dark values and light values, means look at me, right? I should be focusing on that spot. And lower contrast, like in these areas where the values are closer to each other or less well-defined, means I shouldn't look there. So you can see just with a flat drawing with all this information, it's a little bit hard to kind of follow, but here it's easy for me to understand I'm supposed to be looking at the koala. Also gives us a sense of space and volume, so you can really see the depth of the space in terms of value, right? So using value to kind of make these elements feel like they're in different spaces, and also just spacing elements to be overlapping and using general design and space defining principles can really help us define the space better for the viewer and make it easier for them to understand what's going on. We can also use value to create emphasis on very specific things. So you can see in this example here, on the left-hand side, because the environment, uh, everything that's around them, the less important elements or characters are all a lower value, and this one distinct character pops out as being brighter than everything else, then it has the highest order of importance. You can even see there's numbers. I don't know if the numbers necessarily refer to their importance, but you can see them kind of grouped together, right? In this case, we just switched it to a different character, but you can see between the differences between these frames that it feels like there's a different emphasis on who we're supposed to be looking at. Here, I know I'm supposed to be focusing on this pig, and here I feel like I'm supposed to be focusing on that pig. So it tells us what to look at. And here we can see another example of depth, right? So again, this character being a darker value that's closer to the background, this character being higher contrast, really gives us an idea of who we're supposed to be looking at. And it makes it really easy to look at and immediately know what I'm supposed to be thinking and understanding of this space. Here's just one more example I want to show, right? Great characters, great line art, but this is just like chaotic. It's so hard to follow. As soon as we just mask out some simple values for the characters in these different spaces, it's really easy for me to know where things are and just read things easier, right? It's just easier for me to read the characters against the background. You can see all the line values were exactly the same on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, they took the environment and they actually made it lighter so that it wouldn't confuse or jumble up with the character's line art. So here's just some more examples I wanted to show really quickly using value just to establish differences in space. So this isn't necessarily meaning that something that's closer to you or closer to light has to be light and then things that are further away or in a shadow have to be dark. But you can use value blocking to make things feel like they're in different planes, especially when they overlap. So in this case, from I'm trying to remember who this is actually. Oh, Gustave Doré. So he has these characters from I think it's Dante's Inferno. So Virgil and Dante are standing here, and they're in this dark gray, and then the elements behind them are different values to help us understand the space better. So we have this dark cave or shadow on the rock back there, right? Compared to this actual rock color right here, these values probably wouldn't have jumped out as far. So we put this like dark field behind them, and he also used, you have this gray line of souls that are marching through some stage of afterlife, and that he specifically brightens them here. So we really have highest contrast in values, so we're really focusing here, and it's also helping us understand the space and separation of background, middle ground, foreground between these characters. Here's another example from Storyboard, right, from Cars, Pixar. And so, simple value blocking to make these characters separate from their environment a little bit better, and also giving a little bit of context on the ground, right? So where they sit in space, and then also a little bit of value shading on them as well to tell us their volume, which is very helpful. Not necessary, but helpful. Here's another example. In this case, we're getting a little bit of lighting information. So we're getting information that they're supposed to be kind of a bit in shadow, but with a rim light around them, which makes them a little bit more menacing. So you can definitely use lighting cues where you want to in storyboarding process to illustrate to someone what that moment is supposed to feel like in the final film. So here's some kind of do's and don'ts, visual guides to show you how this can be helpful for clarity's sake in storyboards. So making clear value silhouettes obviously makes it really easy to distinguish one area or object from another. Increasing contrast by putting a light value over a dark value, or a dark value over a light value, right? Increases contrast and draws our attention. You can use a little bit of tone to suggest volume, especially if you're having a hard time drawing something and making it look dimensional, and it needs to look dimensional to kind of illustrate to the viewer what's happening. Be careful of some of these options, and here's some solutions and things like that. But in this case, we have a background that's really busy. So by fixing that, we create kind of like a halo effect. So these lines aren't intersecting and connecting with the characters' lines, right? Because when they touch and they start connecting, it's easier for them to feel like they combine in space. But when we create this kind of like halo effect, it's easy to separate the character. Tangents, and this is kind of similar to a busy background, but lines that just start to touch and pierce the character start to, again, mix the character and blend them with their environment or the background. And so, again, kind of eliminating those lines that are touching the characters can really help with that. And so a white background is actually pretty safe. It's usually a good idea to kind of, where you can, just have a very light or blank background if the environment isn't necessary, because then we can just focus on the read easier. Um, but if you have, like, if you want to have an environment context and you think it's important and you're that artist who is quick enough to implement that into their storyboards, at least knocking down kind of like this. These are all kind of boiling down to like the halo effect. But just kind of knocking down that background behind the character can really, really help with just distinguishing a character from the environment. Using a little color, don't be afraid to do that if you have that in your arsenal, right? It's just like using value contrast. We're really just punching the attention on what we're supposed to be looking at. So with this unripe to ripe tomato, we'd have no question of what we're supposed to be looking at in all these frames. And here, yeah, here again, we're using color. In this case, I know this character isn't important. All I know is this character and this character are important. And also, especially since everybody's a car, colors might help me identify which car is who. When you're deciding on your cuts and shots, it's a good idea to motivate your camera cuts. So kind of like continuity, you don't really want to, in this case, you don't really want to make a change in a camera or a shot just for the sake of making a change in the camera or shot. There's several things that can motivate a reason for you to move to a different camera. It's kind of like if you're watching something from far away, like maybe a surgery, and someone, or maybe you're watching someone perform something, right? Like let's say you're watching someone do a demo of how to do a particular technique in, oh fuck, this is stupid. So we're going to wrap up with some final general rules for drawing your storyboards that are not necessarily integral for great boards, but will make them easier to understand and read. So in this case, silhouette is a great way for making things recognizable and easy to read, right? So making a character's body and their features easy to read and understand, and their actions. So it's kind of blurry, but you can see this example from Jiminy Cricket. He's licking this ice cream cone. And so staging him in this specific way makes it easy for us to read the action at a glance, right? When the ice cream cone is in front of his body, it starts to kind of get a little confusing. This is an example of Mickey Mouse, who's well known for having a very recognizable and iconic silhouette. And so that was part of their rules when doing anything related with Mickey Mouse, is that his ears were always going to be easy to read and from afar. And we can see this, again, sorry for the blurriness, this character drinking or sipping soup, right? We don't need to see the details, but the silhouettes, we understand right away what the heck is happening. And that's all about how his elements of his body are not overlapping each other. So here silhouette is being used for different purposes, which you can use to great effect in your own storyboards. So in this case, it can be used for contrast and drama. So we have these characters silhouette against strong lighting situations, like an explosion or character who's being silhouetted by a lightning bolt. Here we can see a silhouette is being used to create a mysterious introduction of a character, right? So we have this character seeing a dark figure walk towards them, and then when they enter the light, oh, hey, it's Billy. We can use silhouette to put emphasis on our focal points and what we're supposed to be looking at in the frame. So in this situation, we have the silhouettes of the characters are providing context of what a character is doing or looking at, but we don't want to focus on them. So with this fish plate, I don't want to focus on the character. I just want to focus on what he's looking at on the plate. Or this character looking at the stars. I don't want to focus on the character necessarily in their details. I just want to see what they're looking at. Don't make everything flat and parallel. Give yourself some perspective and use depth cues like value to make the space easier to understand for the person who's looking at your storyboards. Give yourself plenty of room to draw. Make sure to treat this like a camera frame, and so not like a physical wall and ceiling that's blocking these characters in. So give yourself plenty of room to draw and be smart about how you're staging your scene elements and your characters within the camera's frame. So something you'll see in a lot of storyboards is the use of arrows. Kind of like text on the frame, this tells us something that's hard to illustrate in a storyboard. In this case, arrows are usually meant to indicate a character's path through space, like if they're moving from the left hand side of the frame to the right hand side of the frame, but you want to draw extra boards out, or to show more commonly a camera move. So in this case, we are showing two different camera moves with arrows. In this case, we have a single storyboard frame, right? And we want to show that the camera isn't cutting to a new frame, it's just getting closer. So in this case, we're using arrows drawn from the corners of the frame into a smaller cropping on the character to tell us that the camera starts out wide and then zooms in or trucks in closer to the face. And here's an example of the opposite, right? Where we start out close up and we want to move back and get a wider shot. Here we have a pan. So we want to illustrate to our team with our storyboards that this isn't a cut between two shots, right? We're not changing, like instantly changing from one camera to the next. This is the same camera. We just want it to rotate and look at something else in the frame. So we show these arrows drawing and even say something like pan camera to the right, to let the audience know that, or not the audience, but our team that we're showing the storyboards know that this shot's supposed to have the camera rotate from the woman to the keys on the table. So here's how another storyboard artist is using arrows to signify different information about cameras. So on the top, he's drawing arrows, he or she drawing arrows from the corners into the smaller square, just like we were looking at the other one, to zoom in. And then they're using these depth arrows right here to let us know that we want to push in. So we're not actually changing the zoom, we're moving the camera forward, right? So when you're drawing your storyboards, to help us ground our characters and understand space a little bit, it's a good idea to use a bit of perspective and a little bit of depth to try to give more dimensionality to your drawings wherever you can. All of these examples I'm going to show you, for the most part, are pretty simple drawings. They're not complex. They're not really, you can see they're just stick figures with a couple lines, but it really adds to our understanding of what we're looking at. So avoid flat staging where you can and try to work in perspective. Using grid lines and perspective lines on the ground can really help you establish a sense of perspective in your image. So in this case with this robot, I wouldn't have known I was looking down at the ground without this drawing of the grid for representing the ground. You can see here in this example, sorry for these really crunchy pictures, but you can see when you just draw it like a character just standing on a flat, no perspective, orthographic environment, it could really be hard to understand what's happening in the space from the viewer's standpoint. Is he walking on a tightrope? Is he actually standing on something? Is this a table? I don't know what it is. See on this example on the right from one of the Madagascar movies, we have these perspective lines, these grid lines, and this understanding of perspective is really helping us understand scale, where the camera is especially, and that is super helpful from the layout artist's point of view. If they get these storyboards, they know, okay, I need to put the camera down low on the ground, looking up, and these characters are this far away. Without this perspective, it can be really difficult to understand. Like if I didn't have these ground lines or this wall line, I wouldn't understand that these characters are actually far away from each other, or even at the cameras really far down, close to the ground. And so I might think the character's scale is different, right? I might think this penguin might be the same scale as these characters, or I might think they're floating in the air or something like that. So using perspective can really help out. So, like I said before, you don't have to draw anything fancy. Do a little exercise if you feel like you're rusty on drawing perspective, and just draw some little ground planes with some perspective lines going to a vanishing point, right? So you can see in all these, they're more or less just going to one or two vanishing points. And so they're very simple, but again, just this really small element helps us understand space, camera position, camera angle so much better. This example from one of the maybe DC movies or maybe the cartoon movies, I'm not sure. With Wonder Man and or Wonder Woman and Superman fighting each other, it's super complex, like in terms of their movements, right? The camera is doing all kinds of complex orbits around characters, is no longer grounded or near the horizon line or looking at it, like especially in this one, right, where like a bird's eye view up in the sky. And so without a point of reference, this could be really hard to understand when you're pitching these stories. But because the artist drew this little fake city skyline with perspective lines and horizon lines, it's easy for us to understand, okay, he's going up, he's flying, he's kind of at the same level as the buildings. He's not actually up in the sky yet. Okay, now I can see he's, you get a sense of understanding how the characters are moving through this really complex environment and action sequence. So without those, this would be really hard to follow. Here's a little bit more of a simpler example, but they don't have to be just, flat grid-like lines, right? It could describe the space a little bit. So you have these undulating like snow hills, and you also have these characters grounded within that ground plane that's been drawn. And here we have an action sequence probably from the last Avatar or Last Airbender, Avatar Last Airbender. And you have these three characters, and we get a sense just from this rough sketch of the environment and a little bit of perspective that they're like Aang is this character is further back away from us, Katara is in the middle ground, and Sokka is in the foreground. So without that, we kind of lose that sense of space and scale, and this character could be a really tiny floating monkey character or something like that without seeing a little bit of a representation of the space. So I want to look at just two more examples of storyboards and how the things we've talked about up to this point have been used successfully. So in this case, this is from Brave. We have Merida and her mom who transforms into a bear, right? And so it starts off with this shot with like this lighting information that's really important. So they really went to town in terms of working on value to give us an idea from the rest of the team what the lighting situation is going to be like here, because it's apparently really important. So they're sneaking around. I think she has her mom covered in a cloak, and they're trying to rush upstairs past this door. Okay, and then once she's inside the room, we see her react to her mom, right? So we start off with this dark silhouette, this large silhouette. You get her reaction. Again, and look at the perspective and the environment telling us information about the camera, right? So we know from this shot right here, because of those little, they're rough drawings, but these little perspective cues is telling me, oh, okay, I'm looking up. So this is an up shot at the back of the mom bear, right? And this one we can see kind of the cobblestone floor, and I know that, oh, I'm looking down on Merida because I'm looking down on the floor. Okay, she turns around, we get her reaction, right? Thinking about motivated cuts and the kind of like the flow of the scene. We have the mom bear reacting to like, what the heck is she screaming about? She turns to look off camera. She sees her shadow, right? And it's this shadow silhouette of a bear. We get her reaction because she doesn't realize she's a bear yet. And so she freaks out. And then we see her kind of backing up and like trying to protect her daughter. And then we want to get this closer shot of Merida's reaction to her mom bear, who she doesn't really know is her mom, I think, at this point, touching her as a bear. And so we have this pretty funny interchange between these characters where the mom's trying to explain to her, like kind of calm her down or figure out what's going on, but is a horrifying bear while she's doing it. So we have these camera cuts motivated by changes in information and wanting to see new information regarding characters' reactions to something, or seeing new elements that are entering off frame. So last example I wanted to walk through is this example from the visualization department. This was a graduate student group project that was done for the summer industry course. And so I thought it was a great illustration of all that we talked about so far about storyboards and creating effective storyboards. So here we actually start off in a really interesting way for this film. It actually starts off not focusing on the character or in the environment, it's focusing on a detail in the environment. And it's this jewel that's going to be important for the rest of the film that's embedded into this asteroid. And the character skitters in off frame a bit, right? He's not easy to see. He reaches down, grabs the crystal, and this actually motivates a camera move, not a camera cut, but a camera move. And so by him grabbing down, reaching and grabbing that crystal and pulling it up, we move up with that crystal to see this character or our protagonist enter the film. And it's just a creative way of shooting this to make a connection with the audience with this jewel and introduce our character in an interesting way and the relationship with that important element in the film. So here we cut to a new shot. And the purpose of the shot is to prepare us for the following shot, revealing that a giant asteroid is about to crash into him. So this shot is meant to kind of establish his reaction or show his reaction and reveal it in kind of a interesting or comedic way. So we have the character, we're looking over his shoulder. He turns to look over his shoulder and peek at what's coming up behind him. We even have this little arrow indicating that he's turning his head. And then we have these camera drawing lines on our storyboard to let us know that we want to zoom in or punch in closer to his face to kind of accentuate the moment and his reaction. And then we have that shot where we want to see what he's looking at, which is a giant asteroid careening towards him. And here we have that silhouette. It might be a lighting thing. It might just be for clarity's sake, but it creates that dramatic kind of lighting situation and also lets us know that we want to focus on this asteroid and we're not focusing on him particularly. So we can tell from these numbers that the artist used on these storyboards which ones are supposed to be new camera shots, new cuts. And so we have one, right? They circled one and also 1 out of 2, which tells us that these are all supposed to be the same camera angle, right? We're not supposed to be switching to a new camera yet. So we can see here, this one goes from 3 and now it's at 4. Now we're at a different camera angle. And so we have this character jumps off, leaves frame, and we motivate to a new cut. And this one might be a little confusing, but the framing, that little mini frame that's inside of my camera, my storyboard frame, and those arrows tell me that we're supposed to start the camera really, really close up or tight or zoomed in on the spaceship. It might be kind of hard to see because of the blurriness of this image, but we have this framing on the spaceship and then it zooms out, right? And that's what those arrows and that little framing means. So in this case, the artist is doing something really fun with revealing the character's destination, like what they're going to be going towards, and then showing the distance that they have to travel to get there and showing them in relationship to that distance and to that object. So this zoom out is a really fun way of just showing us what his target is or what he's going for, and also kind of showing the monumental task he has to do of traveling through this asteroid field to get there. So frames 5, 6, 7, and 8 are meant to just show like a series of actions that the character takes to get to his destination. I don't want to go into detail with these ones, but I do want to bring to your attention the use of value to make the space more readable and understandable. And so in this case, we're using low contrast of these dark elements of the background against the dark element of space to make these background asteroids not important. We don't want to focus on that, right? We have these foreground elements to let us know that we're kind of peeking through the asteroid field and giving us a sense of depth and space. And we can clearly read the most important elements here. We have the giant asteroid that's always moving forward. We have the little tiny spurt of the main character flying through space. And then we can see his destination easily isolated in high contrast. And so it's really easy to read this board. So something I just wanted to call attention is all 3 of these boards are pretty chaotic and the scenes are very complicated and dynamic. But the way that the artist approached making these storyboard frames makes it easy for me to, as a viewer, to understand and follow. So here we have another shot that's similar to shot 4, right? Where we start off tight on the spaceship and we zoom out to see the character flying towards the spaceship. In this case, we're starting wide on the spaceship and we zoom in on the door, right? Because we want to know exactly what he's aiming for. So he's going to be aiming specifically for that door hatch and he wants to fly through there, right? And now we have his reaction, right? So, and that's making a connection between him looking at that door hatch, right? So that's his intention. That's what he's going for. Okay, and then now we're staging the shot inside, right? And the purpose for this one is a comedic note that we want to hit with the film, the final punchline. And so you have him flying towards it. He's about to get there. And because we're right here, we can't really see what's coming. And then all of a sudden, an asteroid flies out of screen right outside the ship and knocks him out, right? And so it's we like feel like he's almost to his destination. We're in the destination and we don't see him get blindsided, right? Or T-boned by that meteor that comes by. And then the crystal gently floats into the spaceship.